Donald Trump is visibly panicking tonight, and the reason is absolutely humiliating. The reckless crisis he helped ignite is spiraling across the globe. Allies are quietly backing away, and Trump, true to form, is now lashing out in public while accidentally exposing the grotesque reality behind his disastrous foreign policy gamble. What we are watching right now isn't strength. It isn't strategy. It's a desperate man trying to pretend that a geopolitical firestorm is somehow part of the plan. And the nightmare moment comes when Trump opens his mouth and makes a stunning admission. In a recent interview, he openly attacks one of America's closest allies, the United Kingdom, complaining that Prime Minister Keir Starmer did not help at all in the U.S. and Israeli military campaign targeting Iran. Think about how humiliating that is. The self-proclaimed master negotiator, the guy who bragged he could fix everything with a phone call, is now publicly whining that longtime allies refuse to follow him into another Middle East escalation. But it gets even worse. Trump then declares that the United States doesn't really need its allies anymore to wage war in the region. That single statement reveals the dangerous magical thinking driving this entire operation. Alliances are disposable. Diplomacy is weakness. Escalation is the default setting. Meanwhile, the consequences are erupting everywhere. Protests, attacks on diplomatic facilities, rising tensions spreading across multiple countries. And Trump's response isn't leadership. It's panic. It's deflection. And it's the unmistakable sound of a disastrous strategy beginning to collapse in real time. Now, before Trump and the MAGA propaganda machine start spinning this into some heroic story about strength and leadership, let's slow this down and look at the receipts. Because the gap between what Trump claimed before and what he is admitting now is absolutely staggering. For years, Trump has been telling the same story. According to him, the United States under his leadership commands unmatched loyalty from allies. NATO would be stronger. Europe would fall in line. America's partners would supposedly be eager to stand shoulder to shoulder with him in any global confrontation. That was the sales pitch. But now we're seeing the reality, and it looks completely different. Let's look at what Trump himself is saying right now. In a phone interview discussing the escalating conflict with Iran, Trump openly complains that the British Prime Minister did not help at all. Not, we had a strategic disagreement. Not, we're coordinating privately. No, Trump is publicly venting that one of the closest military allies the United States has had for decades refused to fully back the operation. And here's the critical context Trump conveniently leaves out. The British government had already made its position clear. Prime Minister Starmer stated that the United Kingdom would focus on defensive actions, not direct participation in offensive strikes. Britain was willing to allow U.S. forces access to certain military bases for logistical purposes, but it stopped short of joining the attacks themselves. That's called diplomacy. That's called caution. That's called trying to prevent a regional war from exploding into something even worse. But to Trump, that restraint is treated like betrayal. Let me show you the contradiction here. For years, Trump has mocked America's alliances as weak, unnecessary, even burdensome. He has repeatedly complained that the United States carries too much of the global security burden. MAGA rhetoric constantly pushes the idea that America should act alone if necessary. Now suddenly, when allies don't jump into a dangerous escalation on command, Trump is complaining that they didn't help enough. You can't have it both ways. Either alliances matter or they don't. And Trump reveals the contradiction himself when he says something extraordinary, that the United States no longer really needs allies to wage war in the Middle East. That line is astonishing because it exposes the underlying worldview driving this entire situation. The alliances that have shaped global stability for decades are being treated as optional accessories, useful only when they obey. That isn't leadership. That's geopolitical gaslighting. Trump spent years insisting that he alone could rebuild America's relationships and command global respect. Now we're watching, in real time, those relationships fracture under the pressure of his own decisions. And that's only the beginning of this story. Now let's slow this down and really examine what is happening, because the deeper you go into the details, the more disturbing this entire situation becomes. The headlines alone are chaotic enough, but when you start connecting the dots, you begin to see a pattern of reckless escalation and geopolitical instability that Trump is desperately trying to downplay. Let's start with the chain of events that pushed tensions into overdrive. Following the assassination of Iran's supreme leader, Ayatollah Ali Khamenei, Protests erupted across several countries with large Shia Muslim populations. Pakistan quickly became one of the most volatile flashpoints. Demonstrations spread across major cities, and in Karachi, the situation spiraled dramatically when crowds began pushing toward the U.S. consulate. Now, here's where things take a serious turn. According to U.S. officials, U.S. Marines stationed at the diplomatic compound opened fire as protesters breached the outer perimeter of the consulate. Let that sink in for a moment. This is an extremely rare scenario. American Marines rarely discharge weapons at diplomatic facilities overseas because the implications can escalate tensions instantly. And the situation was already combustible. Local authorities in Karachi reported that at least 10 people were killed during the clashes surrounding the compound. Meanwhile, government officials in Pakistan confirmed that nationwide demonstrations tied to the Iran crisis had already resulted in at least 26 deaths across the country. Streets were filled with tear gas. Protesters were clashing with security forces. Videos circulating online showed chaotic scenes of people running from gunfire and explosions. You cannot look at that situation and call it under control. And yet Trump continues to insist that everything is going very well. Now, let's move to another layer of this story that makes the situation even more unsettling. A newly revealed intelligence operation has exposed just how deeply Israel had infiltrated Iran's surveillance infrastructure in the years leading up to the assassination of Khamenei. According to intelligence sources, Israeli operatives had secretly hacked into Tehran's traffic camera system, gaining access to a massive network of real-time surveillance feeds across the capital. Think about what that means. Traffic cameras, which most people assume are harmless municipal infrastructure, were quietly transformed into a sprawling intelligence grid. Those feeds were encrypted and transmitted to intelligence servers where analysts could monitor the movements of security personnel protecting Iran's leadership. Now here's the chilling part. One specific camera reportedly captured the area where security drivers and bodyguards parked their vehicles near a government complex connected to the Supreme Leader's residence. Analysts were able to observe routines, track vehicles, and build detailed behavioral profiles of the security teams responsible for protecting high-ranking Iranian officials. In other words, they weren't just watching Tehran. They were mapping the daily lives of the people guarding Iran's most powerful figure. And it didn't stop with cameras. Intelligence operatives also reportedly infiltrated Iran's mobile phone infrastructure. In the hours before the assassination strike, telecommunications towers near the target location were allegedly manipulated so that incoming calls to the security team would receive a constant busy signal. Imagine the implications of that for a moment. If those reports are accurate, it means that when the attack began, members of the security detail could not receive warning calls or alerts. Communications were effectively cut off at the most critical moment. This is the kind of sophisticated intelligence operation that takes years to construct. It involves signal intelligence, human sources, algorithmic data analysis, and the coordination of multiple intelligence agencies working in tandem. Which brings us back to the broader picture Trump is trying to sell. Because while he is boasting about decisive action and claiming the operation was necessary to eliminate a nuclear threat, the fallout from that decision is rippling outward in ways that could destabilize entire regions. Protests erupting across Pakistan, diplomatic compounds under siege, drone attacks targeting U.S. facilities in the Middle East, and intelligence revelations showing just how deeply covert operations have penetrated the infrastructure of a sovereign nation. This isn't the picture of a clean, controlled military strategy. This is the picture of a geopolitical powder keg, where every new revelation makes the situation more volatile. And the deeper we dig into the details, the more it looks like the consequences of this operation are only just beginning. Now here's the bigger picture that Trump and his allies absolutely do not want people talking about. Because what we're witnessing right now isn't just a single foreign policy crisis. It's part of a much larger pattern. A pattern of reckless decision-making, chaotic leadership, and the kind of magical thinking that has followed Trump through every phase of his political and business career. Let's start with the obvious reality. Trump is trying to project strength while the situation around him is becoming more unstable by the day. Diplomatic facilities are under threat, protests are erupting across multiple countries, drone attacks are targeting American locations in the Middle East, intelligence operations are spilling into the public domain, and instead of carefully managing the crisis, Trump is going on the offensive against allies who refuse to blindly follow his lead. That's not how stable leadership behaves. That's how someone behaves when the cracks are starting to show. And if this pattern feels familiar, it should, Because this same approach, escalate first, deal with consequences later, has defined Trump's track record for decades. Look at the business record: casinos that collapsed, Trump stakes that vanished, Trump University that ended in fraud lawsuits. The pattern is always the same: bold claims, grand promises, and then the slow motion unraveling when reality catches up. Now apply that same pattern to global politics. Instead of failed state companies, the stakes are now international alliances. Instead of bankrupt casinos, the risk is military escalation between nuclear-armed powers. And the consequences are far more dangerous. Even some of Trump's own supporters are beginning to feel uneasy about the situation. The MAGA media ecosystem spent years selling the idea that Trump was the only leader strong enough to prevent global chaos. Yet here we are watching tensions spike across the Middle East, diplomatic compounds under attack, and warnings from foreign leaders that the current trajectory could push the world towards something far worse. In fact, Russian security officials have already issued chilling warnings about the direction this conflict could take. They argue that regime change operations targeting major geopolitical rivals risk triggering a chain reaction that spirals toward a much larger global confrontation. Whether you agree with that analysis or not, the fact that such warnings are now being openly discussed tells you something about how volatile the situation has become. And while all of this is unfolding, Trump continues delivering the same familiar performance: ranting, blaming, insisting everything is under control, while the evidence piling up suggests the exact opposite. This is the same playbook we've seen over and over again. When something goes wrong, blame the media. When allies disagree, accuse them of betrayal. When consequences appear, pretend the crisis was actually part of the plan. But reality has a way of breaking through even the most carefully constructed political narrative. Because when allies begin distancing themselves, when protests erupt across continents, and when military tensions spread across multiple regions simultaneously, it becomes harder and harder to maintain the illusion that everything is going according to plan. And that's why the cracks we're seeing right now matter. They aren't just political disagreements. They are warning signs. Warning signs that the strategy driving this entire situation may be far more reckless and far more dangerous than Trump and his allies are willing to admit. So step back for a moment and look at what this entire situation reveals. On one side, you have facts unfolding in real time: fracturing alliances, rising tensions across multiple countries, protests erupting in the streets, and intelligence operations spilling into the open. On the other side, you have Donald Trump insisting that everything is going perfectly, that the strategy is working, that the world is somehow safer because of these decisions. Those two realities cannot both be true. This is the difference between governing through facts and governing through illusion, between responsible leadership and reckless escalation, between confronting reality and pretending that sheer confidence can somehow bend the world to your will. And that's why moments like this matter so much, because democracies depend on citizens being able to see through the spin, the propaganda, and the endless stream of excuses that powerful people use when their decisions start producing dangerous consequences. If you want independent analysis that cuts through that noise, make sure you're supporting channels that are willing to speak plainly about what's happening. Hit subscribe and help this channel grow. Share this video with people who need to understand the bigger picture. Because the more clearly we see these patterns, the harder it becomes for anyone, no matter how powerful, to hide behind misinformation and political theater.